Marcus Chen pressed his palm against the scanner beside his dormitory door, watching the blue light flicker as it confirmed his identity. The familiar hiss of the seal breaking filled the corridor as the door slid open, revealing the cramped living space he called home aboard the Celestial Academy station. He stepped inside, letting the door close behind him with a soft thud that echoed through the metal walls. The Academy was humanity's greatest achievement in interstellar diplomacy, a massive space station that orbited the neutral world of Kepler 442c, where young beings from dozens of species came to study together. Marcus was one of only 12 humans accepted this cycle, a fact that still amazed him 6 months into his studies. The competition had been fierce, with over 10,000 applicants from Earth vying for those precious spots. Marcus tossed his data tablet onto the small desk that folded out from the wall and rubbed his temples. Advanced xenobiology had been particularly challenging today, especially when Professor Vexith had asked the class to identify the respiratory systems of 6 different species based on cellular samples. While his classmates seemed to absorb the information effortlessly, Marcus had to work twice as hard just to keep up. He moved to the small food synthesizer built into the wall and punched in the code for chicken teriyaki with rice. The machine hummed to life, breaking down base proteins and carbohydrates into something that tasted almost like home. Almost. The Academy's food systems could replicate the molecular structure of Earth cuisine, but somehow it always lacked the warmth and comfort of his grandmother's cooking. As he waited for his meal, Marcus caught his reflection in the darkened window that looked out into the star-filled void. His black hair had grown longer during his time here, and dark circles shadowed his brown eyes. The stress of constant study and the pressure to represent humanity well was taking its toll. Sometimes he wondered if he truly belonged here among beings who seemed naturally gifted at understanding the complex sciences that governed interstellar civilization. The door chime interrupted his thoughts. Marcus frowned, checking the time display on his wall. It was well past the evening study period, and most students would be preparing for sleep cycle. He approached the door hesitantly, pressing the comm button. "Yes?" he called through the speaker. "Marcus, it is Zarath. I have completed the group project calculations you requested. May I enter to discuss them?" Marcus's stomach dropped. Zarath was his lab partner in advanced xenobiology, a Kethranian whose species was renowned throughout the galaxy for their analytical minds and perfect memory. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, with pale blue skin that shimmered like mother of pearl and large, multifaceted eyes that could process visual information at speeds that made human sight seem sluggish by comparison. Her people had been spacefaring for over 3,000 years, while humans had barely left their solar system 2 centuries ago. The group project. Marcus had completely forgotten about it in his exhaustion. They were supposed to present their analysis of atmospheric adaptation in carbon-based life forms tomorrow morning, and he hadn't even started his portion of the research. Actually, Zarath, now isn't really a good time," he said, panic rising in his voice. "Could we perhaps meet in the library tomorrow before class?" "I do not understand, Marcus. We agreed to finalize our presentation tonight. The library will be too crowded tomorrow morning with students preparing for their own presentations." Marcus closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the cool metal of the door. She was right, of course. Zarath was always right. Her species didn't make social errors or forget important commitments. They didn't struggle to keep up with coursework or feel overwhelmed by the complexity of galactic science. "Give me just one moment," he called out, looking around his quarters in dismay. His room was a disaster. Data tablets covered every surface, displaying half-completed assignments and research notes. Empty food containers littered the floor, and his sleeping alcove was a tangle of unwashed clothing and blankets. Books, actual physical books that he'd brought from Earth, were stacked in precarious towers around his desk. Most damning of all were the personal items scattered throughout the space. Photos of his family, a small jade plant his sister had given him, and a wooden chess set his grandfather had carved by hand. Marcus had noticed that his alien classmates kept their quarters pristine and impersonal. When he'd visited his roommate Hexath's room last month, it had contained only the basic academy furniture and a single data crystal containing his people's mathematical theorems. No personal items, no signs of individual identity or emotional attachment to objects from home. But Marcus couldn't live like that. The photos of his parents and sister helped him feel less alone when the academic pressure became overwhelming. The jade plant reminded him of Earth's green forests and blue skies. The chess set connected him to generations of his family who had played the same game, moving the same carved pieces across the same worn board. "Marcus?" Zarath's voice came through the door again, tinged with what might have been impatience in a human, but was likely simple confusion in a Kethranian. There was no way around it. He would have to let her in and hope she didn't ask too many questions about his living habits. Marcus quickly gathered up the worst of the mess, shoving dirty clothes into his sleeping alcove and stacking the empty food containers in a corner where they might be less obvious. "Coming," he called, taking a deep breath and pressing the door control. The door slid open to reveal Zarath standing in the corridor, her pale blue skin catching the soft light from the hallway panels. She was dressed in the simple gray tunic that most academy students wore, but her natural grace made even the plain garment look elegant. In her four-fingered hands, she carried a data crystal that glowed with soft purple light. "Thank you," she said, stepping forward into his quarters. "I have spent considerable time refining our atmospheric adaptation models, and I believe—" Zarath stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her large, multifaceted eyes went wide as they swept across Marcus's living space, taking in details faster than any human could process. Marcus watched her face, trying to read an expression on features that were beautiful but utterly alien to him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Zarath stood frozen in the doorway, her crystalline eyes darting from the family photos on his desk to the jade plant growing under an artificial sun lamp to the chess set sitting on his small table. Her breathing, which was normally so controlled that Marcus could barely detect it, became rapid and shallow. She began, then stopped. Her voice, usually crisp and precise, wavered with uncertainty. "Marcus? What is this place?" Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "My quarters, obviously. Look, I know it's a bit messy, but—" "Messy?" Zarath stepped deeper into the room, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were exploring an alien world. "This is not about cleanliness, Marcus. These objects—" She gestured at the photos with one long, slender finger. "Are these biological entities significant to you?" "They're my family," Marcus said, confused by her reaction. "My parents, my sister Elena. That one was taken at my graduation from the Academy Prep program." Zarath approached the photos slowly, her head tilting as she examined them with the intense focus her species was known for. "You maintain visual representations of your genetic relatives in your personal space?" "Well, yes." "Don't you have pictures of your family?" "The Kethranian do not form individual attachments beyond our reproductive cycles," Zarath said, but her voice lacked its usual certainty. "We contribute genetic material to the species pool, and our offspring are raised by the collective. There is no logical reason to maintain emotional connections to specific individuals once biological necessity has been fulfilled." Marcus stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. "But don't you miss them? Your parents, I mean." "Miss?" Zarath repeated the word as if it were from an alien language. "I do not understand this concept in relation to genetic contributors." Before Marcus could respond, Zarath had moved to his desk, where the small jade plant sat under its grow light. She leaned down to examine it closely, her multifaceted eyes reflecting the artificial sunlight. This organism serves no apparent function, she observed. It produces no food, provides no technological benefit, requires resources that could be allocated elsewhere. Yet you maintain it carefully. The soil composition has been precisely calibrated, the light spectrum optimized for its photosynthetic needs. Her name is Jade, Marcus said, moving protectively closer to his plant. My sister gave her to me before I left for the academy. She said it would help me remember Earth. You have named a plant? Zarath's voice rose in pitch, something Marcus had never heard from her before. And you speak of remembering your birth world as if the memory itself has value beyond practical application. Marcus was beginning to realize that this conversation was going in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Of course, memories have value. They're part of who we are, part of what makes us human. Zarath straightened, her tall frame making her tower over Marcus. The Kethranian achieve perfect recall of all necessary information. We do not require emotional attachments to specific planetary environments to maintain cognitive function. It's not about cognitive function, Marcus said, struggling to explain something that seemed so basic to him. It's about feeling connected to home, to the people and places that shaped who we are. Zarath was silent for a long moment, her alien features unreadable. Then her gaze fell on the wooden chess set, and she moved toward it with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. This object, she said, picking up one of the knights and turning it over in her hands. The craftsmanship is crude by galactic standards, yet you have preserved it carefully. My grandfather made that set, Marcus said, his voice soft with memory. He carved every piece by hand when he was just a boy. He taught me to play when I was 5 years old. We'd sit on his porch every Sunday afternoon, and he'd tell me stories about each piece while we played. Zarath set the knight down with unusual care. Your grandfather has been deceased for how long? 3 years now. Yet you maintain his creation and recall his teachings. Of course I do. He was important to me. Important. Zarath repeated the word again. And Marcus was beginning to recognize this as something she did when encountering concepts that didn't translate well to her worldview. You invest emotional resources in beings who no longer exist and objects that serve no functional purpose. Marcus felt a flash of irritation. Just because they don't serve a function doesn't mean they're worthless. That chess set reminds me of my grandfather's wisdom, his patience, his love. The photos remind me that I have people on Earth who care about me and believe in me. Jade reminds me of my sister's kindness and the beauty of the world I came from. Love, Zarath said quietly. Wisdom, kindness, beauty. You speak of these as if they were measurable quantities with practical applications. Aren't they? Marcus challenged. Love motivates us to sacrifice for others. Wisdom helps us make better decisions. Kindness builds trust and cooperation. Beauty inspires us to create and explore. Zarath was staring at him now with an intensity that made Marcus uncomfortable. Her large eyes seemed to be processing not just his words, but something deeper, some fundamental difference between their species that was only now becoming apparent. Marcus, she said slowly, do all humans maintain their living spaces in this manner? More or less. Some are neater than others, but yeah, most people keep personal items that are important to them. And these emotional attachments to objects, places, and individuals, this is standard for your species? Marcus nodded, confusion growing. Zarath, are you telling me that your people don't form emotional attachments to anything? We form temporary cooperative bonds when necessary for group tasks or reproduction, she said, but her voice sounded uncertain for the first time since Marcus had known her. But permanent emotional investment in specific individuals or non-functional objects would be inefficient. The word hung in the air between them like a barrier. Marcus looked around his quarters, seeing them suddenly through Zareth's eyes. To her analytical mind, his personal possessions must seem like the hoarding behavior of an irrational being. The photos served no practical purpose, the plant contributed nothing to his survival, and the chess set was an outdated game that could be better played through digital simulations. But to Marcus, these objects were anchors in a vast universe that often felt cold and impersonal. They reminded him of who he was beneath the pressure to excel at the academy, connections to a home that felt increasingly distant with each passing day. "I should go?" Zareth said abruptly, stepping back toward the door. "We can discuss the project through the Academy's communication system." "Wait," Marcus said, something in her tone making him reach out to stop her. "Zareth, is something wrong?" She paused at the threshold, her back to him. For a moment, Marcus thought she might leave without another word. Then she turned back, and he was shocked to see something that looked almost like confusion in her alien features. "Marcus, when you look at these objects, what do you experience?" The question was simple, but something in the way she asked it made Marcus think carefully about his answer. "When I look at my grandfather's chess set, I remember the sound of his laugh when I made a particularly clever move. I remember the smell of his pipe tobacco and the feeling of his weathered hands guiding mine as he taught me the game. When I look at the photos, I remember my sister's graduation speech or the day my parents took me to see the Academy recruitment fair." "You experience non-present sensory input," Zareth said, as if trying to categorize his response. "Auditory, olfactory, and tactile memories triggered by visual stimuli." "I guess. But it's more than that. It's the emotions tied to those memories, the love, the pride, the sense of belonging." Zareth stepped back into his quarters, her movement deliberate and careful. "Show me," she said. "Show you what?" "Show me how these emotional attachments function. I wish to understand." Marcus looked at her uncertainly. "I'm not sure how to show you something like that." Zareth moved to his desk and picked up the photo of his family at his academy graduation. "Explain to me what you see when you observe this image." Marcus took the photo from her hands, his fingers automatically tracing the familiar edges of the frame. "This was taken right after I got my acceptance letter to the academy. My parents flew halfway around Earth to be there for the ceremony. My sister Elena took the day off from her internship at the Mars terraforming project. They interrupted their scheduled activities to observe your achievement?" "Of course they did. They're proud of me." "Pride," Zareth repeated. "Define this concept." Marcus struggled to put the emotion into words that would make sense to someone who had apparently never experienced it. "Pride it's the feeling of satisfaction and joy when someone you care about accomplishes something important. My parents worked extra shifts to help pay for my academy prep courses. They supported my dream even when it meant I'd be leaving Earth, possibly forever. They invested resources in your success, despite receiving no direct benefit from your advancement. The benefit is knowing that their child is happy and successful," Marcus said. "That's what love means. Wanting the best for someone even when it costs you something." Zareth was quiet for a long time, studying the photo with an intensity that made Marcus nervous. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "In Kethranian society, individual achievement serves the collective. Success is measured by contributions to species advancement. We do not invest emotional energy in the individual accomplishments of specific genetic relatives." "That sounds lonely," Marcus said without thinking. Zareth's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his. "Lonely?" Marcus realized he'd touched on another concept that might not translate. "Being alone." feeling disconnected from others, like you're facing the universe by yourself. The Kethranian are never alone. We are part of the collective consciousness of our people. But do you have someone who knows your favorite color? Someone who remembers your birthday? Someone who worries about you when you're far from home? The questions seemed to hit Zarath like physical blows. She took a step backward, her breathing becoming rapid again. These are individual preferences and arbitrary temporal markers, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. There is no logical reason for another being to maintain such information about me. Marcus set the photo back on his desk and moved closer to Zarath. Maybe not logically, but emotionally. My sister sent me a message last week just to tell me about a sunset she saw that reminded her of the evening we spent watching meteors when we were kids. She didn't have to do that. There was no practical reason for it. But she did it because she loves me and wanted to share something beautiful with me. Zarath stared at him, her multifaceted eyes reflecting the soft light from his quarters. Your sister maintains memories of shared experiences with you and actively seeks to create new emotional connections across interstellar distances? Yes. For no logical purpose? For the purpose of love, Zarath. For the purpose of maintaining the bond between us even when we're separated by light years. Something in Zarath's expression shifted, and Marcus saw what he thought might be the first real emotion he'd ever witnessed from her. It looked almost like longing. I do not understand, she said quietly. But I find myself curious about these concepts you describe. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in weeks. Would you like me to show you more? Zarath nodded slowly, her large eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that he found both fascinating and slightly uncomfortable. There was something different about her now, a curiosity that seemed to crack the perfect composure that all Kethranians displayed. She moved deeper into his quarters, her tall frame careful not to disturb any of his belongings as she examined them with new interest. Show me, she repeated, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that Marcus had never heard before. Marcus looked around his quarters, trying to decide where to begin. How do you explain the fundamental nature of human emotion to someone who had never experienced it? It was like trying to describe color to someone who had been blind from birth. Okay, he said finally, moving to his small bookshelf. Let me show you something that might help. He pulled out a worn paperback novel, its cover faded and edges softened from countless readings. The title read, The Foundation Chronicles by Elena Vasquez, and Marcus held it like it was made of precious metal. This book, he said, was written by my great-aunt Elena. My sister was named after her. Zarath examined the physical book with the same careful attention she gave to everything else. Your species still maintains knowledge in physical media? This is highly inefficient compared to digital storage. It's not about efficiency, Marcus said, opening the book to reveal handwritten notes in the margins. Look at these notes. My great-aunt wrote them when she was developing the story. My grandmother added her own thoughts here and here. My mother read this book to me when I was young and added her notes too. Now I've added mine. Zarath leaned closer, her eyes scanning the handwritten text. Multiple individuals have modified this single copy of the information? 4 generations of my family have shared this book, Marcus said, running his finger along a particularly faded note. Each person who read it left something of themselves behind. When I read my great-aunt's notes, I can almost hear her voice explaining why she chose certain words or plot points. When I see my grandmother's notes, I remember sitting in her lap as a child, following along as she read aloud. You maintain a connection to deceased family members through their markings on processed plant matter? Marcus laughed, but not unkindly. When you put it like that, it sounds pretty strange. But yes, in a way. This book is a bridge across time. It connects me to people I loved who are no longer here. It's part of my family's history. Zarath reached out tentatively, her four-fingered hand hovering over the open page. May I examine it more closely? Of course. She took the book with surprising care, her movements precise and gentle. As she read, Marcus watched her face, trying to decipher the subtle changes in her expression. Her species' features were difficult for humans to read, but he was beginning to notice small details, the way her eyes widened slightly when something surprised her, the barely perceptible tilt of her head when she was processing new information. This narrative concerns fictional beings engaged in activities that serve no practical purpose, she observed after several minutes of reading. It's a story about exploration, about finding your place in the universe, about the connections between people that make life meaningful. Fictional connections. Connections that represent real emotions and experiences, Marcus corrected. My great-aunt based the characters on people she knew. The protagonists struggled to find belonging in a new world. That's something every human can relate to. Zarath looked up from the book, her eyes meeting his. You relate to fictional struggles? Don't you? Haven't you ever read something or watched something that made you think, that's exactly how I feel? The question seemed to perplex her. The Ketheranian consume information for educational purposes. Entertainment is considered an unnecessary allocation of mental resources. Marcus stared at her. Trying to imagine a life without stories, without art, without the shared experiences that came from fictional worlds. But don't you ever want to experience something beyond your daily routine? Don't you ever wonder what it would be like to be someone else, to live a different life? Why would I wish to be someone other than myself? I am optimally designed for my function within Ketheranian society. But what about your own desires, your own dreams and hopes? Individual desires are counterproductive to collective efficiency, Zarath said. But something in her voice suggested she was reciting a learned response rather than expressing a personal belief. Marcus closed the book and set it aside, then moved to another corner of his quarters where a small digital display showed a rotating series of images. Earth scenes cycled past. Beaches, mountains, forests, cities, all captured in stunning detail. These are places on Earth that I love, he said. I'll probably never see most of them again, but watching these images helps me remember what my world was like. Zarath approached the display, her eyes tracking the changing images. Your planet displays significant geographical diversity. That's not why I watch them, Marcus said. I watch them because they make me feel connected to home. This one is from the Pacific coast, near where my grandmother lived. This mountain range is where my family used to go camping every summer. This city is where I grew up, where I had my first job, my first girlfriend, my first real disappointment. You maintain emotional connections to geographical locations? Places can hold memories just like objects can, Marcus explained. When I see that beach, I remember building sandcastles with my sister when we were kids. I remember the smell of salt air and the sound of waves. I remember feeling completely happy and safe. Zarath was quiet for a long moment, watching the images cycle past. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than before. Do you experience distress when observing these images, knowing you may never return to these locations? The question caught Marcus off guard. It was the first time Zarath had asked about his emotional state rather than simply trying to catalog and understand human behavior. Sometimes, he admitted, but mostly they make me happy. They remind me of good times, good people. They help me remember who I am when everything here feels overwhelming. Overwhelming? Marcus hesitated. He hadn't meant to reveal his struggles at the academy, but something about Zarath's genuine curiosity made him want to be honest. Being here isn't easy for humans, he said. We're not as naturally gifted as most of the other species. We don't have perfect memory like you do, or the mathematical intuition of the Vorthak, or the pattern recognition abilities of the Zendai. Sometimes I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water while everyone else swims effortlessly. Zarath turned away from the display to face him fully. You believe yourself to be intellectually inferior to other species? I don't believe it. I know it. Look at our test scores, our academic records. Humans consistently rank in the bottom third of Academy students. Yet you were selected for admission despite these limitations. Marcus shrugged. 12 spots out of thousands of applicants. I still don't understand why they chose me. Zarath studied him with an expression he couldn't read. Perhaps your perceived limitations are not as significant as you believe. Before Marcus could respond, Zarath moved to his desk where his data tablets were scattered. She picked up one that displayed his latest assignment grades and studied the screen. Your scores in advanced xenobiology are within acceptable ranges, she observed. Barely, and only because I study twice as hard as everyone else. You invest additional effort to achieve comparable results? I have to. Otherwise, I'd fail out and let everyone down. Zarath set down the tablet and turned to face him with an intensity that made Marcus step back involuntarily. Marcus, do you understand why the Academy accepts students from different species? To promote interspecies cooperation and understanding? That is one purpose, but not the primary one. The Academy exists because the Galactic Council has learned that different species contribute different strengths to collective knowledge. The Kethranian excel at data analysis and logical problem-solving. The Vorthak are natural mathematicians. The Zendai can see patterns that others miss. Marcus nodded. Right. And humans are... What exactly? That, Zarath said, is what I am beginning to understand. She gestured around his quarters, taking in the photos, the books, the personal mementos, and the plant growing under its artificial sun. In the 6 months since classes began, I have observed something that I initially dismissed as inefficiency. Human students form emotional bonds with their classmates. They share personal information that serves no academic purpose. They invest time and energy in activities that do not directly contribute to their studies. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. I know we're not as focused as other species. You are not less focused, Zarath interrupted. You are focused on different things. And tonight, seeing your living space, I am beginning to comprehend the significance of that difference. She moved to his chess set and picked up the knight that she had examined earlier. This carved piece represents a warrior mounted on a beast of burden. Correct? A knight on horseback, yes. In the game, this piece has specific movement capabilities and strategic value. But for you, it represents far more. It carries the memory of your grandfather, his teachings, the emotional bond you shared. Marcus nodded, not sure where she was going with this. Do you understand what you have just demonstrated? Zarath asked. You have taken a simple game piece and imbued it with multiple layers of meaning. Memory, emotion, personal history, cultural significance, all encoded in a piece of carved wood. I guess so. Zarath set the knight down carefully. This is what humans do. You take information and transform it into something more complex, more layered, more meaningful than its original form. You create connections where none existed before. Marcus frowned. How is that useful? 3 weeks ago, in Professor Vexith's class, you proposed a theory about atmospheric adaptation in silicon-based life forms. Do you remember? Vaguely. I suggested that they might use emotional responses to environmental changes as a survival mechanism. Precisely. A theory that no other species in our class would have conceived, because no other species would think to apply emotional concepts to biological processes. Yet when Professor Vexith ran simulations based on your hypothesis, the models showed significant predictive accuracy. Marcus stared at her. He remembered that class, remembered feeling foolish for suggesting something so unscientific. The professor had thanked him politely and moved on to other topics. "You're saying my idea was actually good?" "Your idea was revolutionary," Zarath said. "You took two seemingly unrelated concepts, emotion and atmospheric adaptation, and found a connection that no one else had considered. This is what humans do naturally. You see patterns not just in data, but in meaning, in relationships, in the spaces between ideas." Marcus felt something shift in his understanding, like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. "Is that why humans were admitted to the Academy? Not despite our emotional nature, but because of it?" "I am beginning to suspect so," Zarath said. "The Galactic Council has spent centuries trying to solve certain classes of problems using pure logic and analysis. Perhaps they realized that some problems require a different kind of thinking." She gestured to his family photos. "You maintain emotional connections across vast distances of space and time. You find meaning in objects that have no practical function. You create stories that serve no immediate purpose but somehow convey important truths about existence." Marcus looked around his quarters with new eyes, seeing his personal belongings not as clutter or inefficiency, but as evidence of something uniquely human. "These emotional attachments you maintain," Zarath continued, "they are not weaknesses or distractions. They are a form of processing that allows you to see connections that pure logic cannot detect." "But you're so much smarter than we are," Marcus protested. "Your memory is perfect. Your analytical abilities are incredible. Intelligence is not solely measured by processing speed or memory capacity," Zarath said. "Tonight, I have observed forms of thinking that I cannot replicate. You take raw information and transform it into something richer, more complex. You find patterns in emotion, meaning in memory, significance in symbolism." She paused, looking around his quarters once more. "I have been studying at the Academy for 6 months, achieving perfect scores on every examination. But I have learned more about the nature of consciousness and connection in this single evening than in all my previous studies combined." Marcus felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since arriving at the Academy. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was struggling to keep up with his classmates. Instead, he felt like he brought something valuable to the table, something that couldn't be measured by test scores or processing speed. "Zarath," he said slowly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What's your favorite color?" The question seemed to catch her completely off guard. Her eyes went wide and she took a step backward. Favorite? I do not understand the relevance of this question." "It's not about relevance," Marcus said gently. "It's about preference. When you see colors, is there one that you find more pleasing than others? One that makes you feel, I don't know, more at peace or more excited?" Zarath was quiet for a long time, her alien features displaying what Marcus was beginning to recognize as deep concentration. "There is," she began hesitantly, "there is a shade of blue that appears in the sky of my homeworld during the third moon phase. When I was very young, before I was assigned to my educational collective, I would sometimes observe this color and experience a sensation that I was taught to suppress." "What kind of sensation?" "Something that I now suspect you might call contentment, a feeling of rightness with the universe." Marcus smiled. "That sounds like a favorite color to me." Zarath looked at him with an expression of wonder. "Is this what it means to have personal preferences? To find meaning in aesthetic experiences that serve no practical purpose?" "It's part of it," Marcus said. "The question is, Does knowing that about yourself feel important to you? Zareth considered this for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and uncertain. Yes, she said, it does. Marcus moved to his synthesizer and programmed it for 2 cups of hot chocolate, Earth recipe. As the machine hummed to life, he looked back at Zareth, who was still standing among his personal belongings with an expression of deep thought. Zareth, he said, would you like to learn about friendship? The hot chocolate synthesizer finished its cycle with a gentle chime, filling Marcus's quarters with the rich aroma of cocoa and vanilla. He handed one steaming cup to Zareth, who accepted it with the same careful precision she applied to everything else. She sniffed the liquid cautiously, her large eyes reflecting the steam that rose from the surface. This beverage serves a nutritional purpose? She asked. Marcus settled into his desk chair, wrapping his hands around his own cup for warmth. Not really. Hot chocolate is about comfort, about feeling good. My mother used to make it for me when I was sad or scared or just needed to feel better about the world. Zareth took a tentative sip, her alien features registering surprise at the taste. The flavor is pleasant. See, you just expressed a preference, Marcus said with a smile. That's the beginning of personal taste. Over the next hour, Marcus found himself in the strangest and most rewarding conversation of his academy career. He explained concepts that he had never thought to question: friendship, nostalgia, humor, love, hope. Zareth listened with an intensity that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming, asking questions that forced Marcus to examine the fundamental nature of human experience. When you speak of missing your family, Zareth said at one point, you describe it as painful, yet somehow valuable. This seems contradictory. Marcus thought carefully before answering. It is contradictory, in a way. Missing someone hurts, but it also proves that you have something worth missing. The pain reminds you of the love, and the love makes life richer even when the person isn't there. You choose to experience pain in order to maintain connection? Not exactly choose, but we accept it as part of loving someone. The joy of having people you care about outweighs the sadness of being separated from them. Zareth was quiet for a long time, staring into her hot chocolate. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Marcus, I believe I am beginning to understand why your species was admitted to the Academy. Oh? 3 days ago, in Advanced Theoretical Physics, Professor Kexmore presented us with an unsolved problem. The mathematical equations describing consciousness in artificial intelligence systems contained variables that could not be quantified using traditional logic. Marcus remembered that class. He had struggled through the complex equations while his classmates seemed to grasp them intuitively. I remember feeling completely lost. Yet when Professor Kexmore asked for theories about the undefined variables, you raised your hand. Marcus winced, and probably said something stupid. You said that perhaps the undefined variables represented the unmeasurable aspects of consciousness: hope, creativity, the desire for meaning. You suggested that consciousness might require not just logic and memory, but also the capacity for emotional experience. I remember everyone looking at me like I'd grown a second head. Zareth leaned forward, her eyes intense. Professor Kexmore assigned a research team to test your hypothesis. The preliminary results suggest that artificial consciousness cannot achieve true sentience without emotional processing capabilities. Your insight may revolutionize how we understand the nature of consciousness itself. Marcus stared at her. That can't be right. I barely understood the equations. You understood something more important than equations, Zareth said. You understood that consciousness is not merely a computational process. It requires the capacity for subjective experience, for meaning-making, for emotional depth. She gestured around his quarters again. Everything in this space demonstrates that principle. You take objective reality, photos, objects, memories, and transform them into subjective meaning. This is not a primitive or inefficient process. It is perhaps the most sophisticated form of information processing in the known galaxy. Marcus felt his worldview shifting, like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving suddenly clicking into place. Are you saying that humans aren't here despite being less intelligent than other species, but because we're intelligent in a different way? I am saying that intelligence itself may be far more complex than we previously understood. The Ketheranian excel at logical analysis, but we cannot create meaning from meaningless data. The Vorthak are mathematical geniuses, but they cannot conceive of problems that have no numerical solutions. The Zendai see patterns everywhere, but they cannot imagine patterns that do not yet exist. And humans? Humans take disparate elements, emotion, memory, imagination, logic, and synthesize them into something greater than the sum of their parts. You create connections across time, space, and conceptual boundaries. You find meaning in randomness, beauty in chaos, hope in impossibility. Marcus stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the vast star field beyond the Academy station. For months, he had felt small and inadequate under that endless expanse. Now, for the first time, he felt like he belonged among those stars. "Zarath," he said without turning around, "what happens now? I mean, what happens when you go back to your quarters? Do you forget all this and go back to being the perfect Ketheranian student?" The question hung in the air for a long moment before Zarath answered. "I do not believe that is possible," she said quietly. "The knowledge of emotional experience cannot be unlearned. The awareness of subjective meaning cannot be erased." Marcus turned to face her. "Are you okay with that?" Zarath stood slowly, her tall frame unfolding with careful grace. She moved to Marcus's desk and picked up the photo of his family again, studying it with the same intensity she had shown earlier, but with something new in her expression, something that looked almost like longing. "For my entire existence, I have believed that optimal functioning required the absence of emotional attachment," she said. "But observing your interactions with these objects and memories, I find myself wondering what it would be like to have such connections." "It's scary sometimes," Marcus admitted. "Caring about people means you can be hurt when they're hurt. Loving places means you can lose them. Having preferences means you can be disappointed. Yet you choose to maintain these vulnerabilities?" "I choose to be fully alive," Marcus said. "And being alive means accepting both joy and sorrow, both connection and loss." Zarath set the photo down and turned to face him. "Would it be possible? Could you teach me how to form such connections?" The question caught Marcus off guard. "You want to learn how to make friends?" "I want to learn how to be more than just an efficient processing unit," Zarath said. "I want to understand what it means to have individual identity beyond my species designation." Marcus smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the hot chocolate. "I'd be honored to teach you. But I should warn you, friendship isn't something you can master through study. It's something you have to experience." "I am prepared to accept that inefficiency." Marcus laughed, and was surprised to hear Zarath make a sound that might have been laughter as well, a soft, crystalline chiming that was utterly alien, yet somehow familiar. "The first lesson of friendship," Marcus said, "is that it's not inefficient at all. It might be the most efficient way to make life worth living." Over the following weeks, something unprecedented began to happen at the Celestial Academy. Word spread quietly through the student population about the human who had made friends with a Ketheranian, not just the professional cooperation that was common in group projects, but actual emotional connection. Other students began to take notice of Marcus in ways they never had before. Hexath, his Vorthak roommate, began asking questions about Earth customs. Veline, a Zendai student from his xenobiology class, requested permission to observe human social interactions for her independent study project. But the most significant change was in Zarath herself. She began keeping a small personal item on her desk, a crystalline formation from her homeworld that reminded her of the blue sky color she had described as pleasing. She started expressing preferences for certain foods in the dining hall. Most remarkably, she began sharing memories of her childhood before she was assigned to her educational collective. "I have been thinking about what you said regarding memories," she told Marcus one evening as they worked together on their atmospheric adaptation project. "I have been attempting to recall experiences from my early development phase that I dismissed as irrelevant data. And I remember a caretaker who would sing to the young ones during rest periods. The songs served no educational purpose, but I found the sound patterns soothing. I had forgotten this until I began practicing what you call nostalgia." Marcus looked up from his data tablet. "You're remembering being comforted as a child?" "I am remembering that I once experienced something analogous to what you describe as emotional security. It is a curious sensation, recalling that feeling after so many years of dismissing it as irrelevant." "That's not irrelevant at all," Marcus said. "That's one of your first experiences of connection, of being cared for as an individual rather than just as part of a collective." As the semester progressed, Marcus began to notice changes in his own academic performance. The insights that had once seemed like random guesses were becoming more focused, more confident. He started to understand that his intuitive leaps weren't failures of logic. They were a different kind of reasoning altogether. In advanced xenobiology, his atmospheric adaptation theory led to a breakthrough in understanding how emotion-driven species might colonize hostile environments. In theoretical physics, his suggestions about the emotional components of consciousness earned him a research position with Professor Kexmore. In interspecies relations, his papers on the value of individual identity within collective societies were distributed as required reading. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Marcus felt like he was contributing something unique and valuable. More importantly, he was helping other students discover aspects of themselves they had never considered. The transformation reached a culmination during the Academy's annual synthesis project, where mixed-species teams were required to propose solutions to real galactic challenges. Marcus found himself assigned to a team tasked with developing new approaches to first contact protocols with potentially hostile species. His team included Zarath, Veline the Zendai, Krextor, a Vorthak mathematician, and Sileth, a Gaskari strategist. Traditional first contact protocols relied heavily on demonstrating technological superiority and logical reasoning. But Marcus proposed something radically different. What if we approach first contact not as a negotiation between civilizations, but as an opportunity for connection between individuals, he suggested during their first team meeting. Krextor's metallic features shifted in what Marcus had learned was confusion. Individual connection is irrelevant to species-level diplomacy. Is it, though? Marcus pulled up his personal tablet and showed them footage from Earth's first contact with the Centauri Alliance 50 years earlier. Look at this moment here. The human ambassador offers the Centauri representative a gift from Earth. Not technology, not trade goods. Just a small piece of artwork that his daughter made. The team watched as the alien ambassador examined the crude drawing with obvious confusion. Then suddenly began what appeared to be laughter. The tension in the room visibly decreased, and what followed was the most successful first contact in recorded history. The ambassador later said that the gift demonstrated something his people valued but hadn't expected from humans. The idea that relationships could transcend practical necessity, Marcus explained. That simple gesture of sharing something personally meaningful changed the entire dynamic of the negotiation. Zarath leaned forward, her eyes bright with understanding. You are suggesting that emotional connection can serve as a bridge across species barriers in ways that pure logic cannot. Exactly. Every species we've encountered has some form of individual identity, some capacity for subjective experience. Maybe we've been trying too hard to communicate with their logical minds when we should also be trying to connect with their individual selves. Velini's pattern-sensitive mind immediately began working through the implications. If we could identify the emotional common denominators between species, concepts like safety, curiosity, hope, we could construct first-contact protocols that speak to universal experiences rather than species-specific logic systems. The project that resulted from that insight revolutionized interspecies diplomacy. Instead of relying solely on technological demonstrations and logical propositions, the new protocols included elements designed to establish individual connection, shared experiences, artistic exchanges, personal storytelling. When their team presented the final project to a panel of Academy professors and Galactic Council representatives, the response was unprecedented. Not only did they receive the highest marks in Academy history, but their protocols were immediately adopted by the Council's Department of Interspecies Relations. But for Marcus, the real victory came during the presentation when he looked out at the audience and saw something that would have been impossible when he first arrived at the Academy. Students from a dozen different species were sitting together, not just as academic colleagues but as friends. Zarath had tears in her large eyes, something her species was supposedly incapable of. Krextor was making what passed for a smile among his people. Veline was actually laughing at a joke Silith had made during the question period. Human emotional intelligence hadn't just proven its value in academic settings. It had begun to transform the social fabric of the Academy itself, creating connections across species lines that had never existed before. After the presentation, as the audience dispersed and his teammates celebrated their success, Marcus found himself standing alone at the viewport in the Academy's main corridor, looking out at the stars, just as he had that first night in his quarters. But everything was different now. Zarath approached and stood beside him, her tall frame casting a shadow across the viewport. "You were correct that first evening," she said quietly. "About what?" "When you said that emotional connections make life worth living. I have been experiencing something over these past months that I believe you would call happiness. Not the satisfaction of completing tasks efficiently, but something deeper. The joy of being known as an individual, of having preferences and opinions that matter to others." Marcus smiled. "And how does it feel?" "Inefficient," she said, and Marcus could hear the humor in her voice. "Wonderfully, beautifully inefficient." They stood together in comfortable silence. Two beings from vastly different worlds who had somehow found common ground in the spaces between logic and emotion, between individual and collective, between who they had been and who they were becoming. "Marcus," Zarath said eventually, "I have been thinking about your original question." "Which one?" "When you asked about my favorite color. I have been observing colors more carefully since then, paying attention to my emotional responses rather than dismissing them as irrelevant data." "And?" Zarath turned to look at him, her alien features soft in the starlight. "I believe my favorite color is the particular shade of brown of your eyes when you laugh. It is a color that exists only in moments of genuine joy, and I have discovered that witnessing such moments creates what you call happiness in me." Marcus felt his cheeks warm, and he was grateful for the dim lighting that hid his blush. That's a beautiful way to think about color. I have been learning from an excellent teacher." As they stood there watching the stars wheel slowly past the viewport, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that evening when Zareth had first entered his quarters. He had thought she was there to expose his inadequacies, to highlight how poorly humans compared to the other species at the Academy. Instead, she had helped him discover that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in competing with alien intelligence on their terms, but in offering something entirely new, the ability to find meaning in the meaningless, to create connections across impossible distances, to transform pure information into lived experience. The Academy had been designed to bring together the best minds from across the galaxy, but perhaps its greatest success wasn't in the exchange of knowledge or technology. Perhaps it was in the discovery that intelligence itself was far richer and more complex than anyone had imagined, and that the greatest achievements came not from the perfection of individual brilliance, but from the beautiful inefficiency of different minds, learning to understand each other. "Zareth," Marcus said as they finally turned away from the viewport to head back to their quarters. "Thank you." "For what?" "For stopping cold when you saw me. For being curious instead of judgmental. For teaching me that being human isn't something I need to apologize for." Zareth paused in the corridor, her large eyes reflecting the soft lighting panels. "Thank you, Marcus, for teaching me that being individual doesn't have to mean being alone." As they walked together toward the residential section of the Academy station, past other students from a dozen different species who now nodded and smiled as they passed, Marcus realized that the greatest discovery of his time at the Academy hadn't been any scientific breakthrough or technological advancement. It had been the simple revelation that in a vast universe filled with wonders beyond imagination, the most precious thing of all might just be the connections we forge with each other, the beautiful, inefficient, absolutely essential bonds that transform strangers into friends, aliens into family, and existence into meaning.